Well, hello and welcome. I'm Beth Cauffman. First, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many faces in the audience. And of course, I cannot begin my presentation without thanking our Dean, Dean Val-Janess. Without her support, her dedication, her tireless efforts, this center would not be functioning and doing nearly as well as we are. We are indebted to her for making this possible. So a huge thank you to Val. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about my research. I'm a developmental psychologist, and my research focuses on the intersection between adolescent development and juvenile justice. And thus, I hope for those of you who are TV fans, you might appreciate my title of Arrested Development. But I thought I'd start by telling you a few stories. And the first story I want to tell you about is a little boy, 12 years old. His name is Paul Gingrich. And in 2010, Paul Gingrich and his 15-year-old friend, Colt Lundy, decided to murder Colt Lundy's stepfather. Now, Colt Lundy was being abused by his stepfather, had coerced Paul to help him. Paul, sitting next to Colt with a gun, waiting on the couch, next to Colt saying, "I don't think this is a good idea, I don't think this is a good idea." Colt's stepfather burst through the door, obviously very angry seeing the two boys with the gun. They opened fire. Of course, when Paul opened fire, both shots ricochet. One does hit Colt's stepfather, but they weren't the murdering blows. Unfortunately, both boys were tried as adults. Both boys were given 25 to 30-year sentences. And now we have a 12-year-old lifer sitting in jail for a conspiracy to commit murder, even though he was 12 years old at the time. And as you're going to hear later today, do we even know whether he was competent to stand trial? So I'm going to be talking to you about some of these adolescent issues. But before I go on to tell you about some of the data, I think it's important to tell you some of the other things that have been happening around the country. This happened in 2010. Also in 2010, how many of you have ever done something you kind of regret doing during your adolescence? And please don't raise your hand. Maybe you threw a spitball, and that spitball may have hit somebody. Well, in fact, that's exactly what Andrew Mickle did, an honors student, ROTC student, planning to attend the U.S. Naval Academy when he graduated from high school. But as a freshman, sitting in the lunchroom, he thought it'd be fun to unscrew the ballpoint pen, put some pellets in, and shoot across the room. Well, of course, they did hit somebody. They did create red marks on the person's body. Well, Paul was suspended for 10 days. Rightly so, he'd done something he shouldn't have done. But then, zero tolerance policies. That didn't seem extreme enough, so he was expelled for 1 year. And then that didn't seem serious enough. He was then charged with assault, is now given a criminal record, and his dreams of attending the U.S. Naval Academy are now gone. So we've taken an honor student with no prior record, given him a criminal record, and now destroyed his future career plans. To even push this a little further, for those of you with adolescents, technology has somewhat changed the way adolescents engage with one another. For instance, sexting. And that's when you get those very interesting photos on your phone. For those of you who do this, if you receive those photos and they are of a person under the age of 18, that's also considered child pornography, even if the two of you engaged and agreed to do that together. For instance, in a case A.H. v. Florida, a 16-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy engaged in a sexual act. And in fact, they didn't even share this photo with anybody. It was just on their phone and was observed. Because somebody found this photo on their phone, it was not sent, but somebody found it, they then decided to charge them with child pornography. They've now been charged with child pornography, now have criminal records, and of course, are subject to possibly registering as sex offenders under Megan's Law for the next 25 years. So, we also know adults don't always make great decisions. We also know this could happen at any age. But thinking about these types of situations, and if you don't know, this is Andrew Weiner. But anyway, the 12-year-old sentenced to life in prison. You have 9th graders kicked out of school for a spitball. And you have text messages considered child pornography. This is actually where my research focuses on, and the fundamental question that my research focuses on. Are adolescents different from adults in ways that would require different treatment under the law? And if so, how would you even consider these developmental factors? And where should you even draw the line between childhood and adulthood? Where is the right line? What should the law be doing? And this is where my research now focuses. And often what happens is I get phone calls from reporters all the time dealing with these very cases. Well, why would an adolescent do that? Adolescents know the difference between right and wrong. A 5-year-old knows the difference between right and wrong. Your ability to control that versus your ability to know that is really where my research focuses on, because adolescents aren't stupid. In fact, adolescent development, and during this adolescent period, is when we see the most growth in cognitive ability. Kids are able to take other people's perspective, to think abstractly, and for those of you with children, they can argue very effectively. So this becomes the paradox. If adolescents are so smart, why do they do such very stupid things? And this is what my colleagues and I have been working on. I've been part of a MacArthur Foundation research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice. And we had the opportunity to do a large-scale study to address this very question. And what we did was we looked at both their intellectual ability as well as their emotional maturity. And here is what we found. At around age 16 years, you can see that adolescents look equivalent to adults in their cognitive functioning. Now, this might be very important when you think about other types of decision, like medical decision-making, in terms of school decision-making for classes. But other development still is going on. No parent would say, well, this kid's now an adult at 16. So what else is happening? This is where we looked at what we call maturity or psychosocial development. And as you can see, that continues to develop well into the age of 25. So we have this cognitive system and this emotional system. And the two of them do not develop in tandem. The cognitive system develops sooner than the emotional system. The best way that I've learned to talk about this is by saying it's like starting the engine without a skilled driver. The car works, the engine runs, but the person behind the wheel can't control the car. So kids have the cognitive tools. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they just don't have the emotional ability to control that. So when you ask an adolescent, why did you do that? And they say, I don't know. They're actually telling you the truth because they knew that they shouldn't, but they just couldn't stop themselves. And in fact, we have data to show that this is why we see the disconnect between what kids know and what kids do. And a lot of this research has to do with the advance in the area of neuroimaging, and in particular in the area of the frontal lobe. Now that's the area right behind your forehead, the frontal lobe of the brain. We call it sort of the CEO of the company. It runs the way we control our impulses, our planning, our gut intuitions. It's basically the boss. Well, that part of the brain is not fully developed until around age 25. And yet that's the part of the brain that controls those emotional control systems. So we actually have evidence to now help us better understand why cognitively kids could know things, but emotionally they can't control them. The part of the brain that's responsible for that emotional control is still developing. So then, young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures. Thank goodness for New Yorker cartoons, because this is exactly what we're starting to see. That do we need to wait for kids to grow up? And in fact, when we start to take this research into the courtroom, one of the things that we're seeing is that what do kids know and how does this work in the courtroom setting? And in fact, this was part of a large-scale study we did with the MacArthur Network on their competence. And we did this in 4 locations with adolescents and adults who were both in the community, having never had a record, and those who were incarcerated, who were in detention facilities. It was over 1,300 participants. And what's most important to note is that we used a cognitive assessment tool to look at competence to stand trial. This is what many judges and attorneys use to evaluate competence. Is this person competent? Do they meet the Dusky standard for competence? It gets to 3 areas: understanding, reasoning, and appreciation. I'll be focusing solely on the outcomes of understanding and reasoning today. And the bottom line answer is, we have kids 15 and younger who do not understand what's happening in the courtroom. And in fact, you can see nearly a third of those 11 to 13-year-olds and about a fifth of the 14 to 15-year-olds are not competent to stand trial. It's important to note, though, look at that line around 16 and older. Again, we saw those cognitive capacities. They seem equivalent to adults. Now, notice I didn't say as smart as adults or better than adults, because notice we did have some adults who were not competent to stand trial. But kids are more vulnerable. They are less likely to be able to understand what's happening in the courtroom. Now, when I show you these data, folks say, well, but kids who've been in the system before, they've been through this before, they'd have expertise. They would be more aware of what a judge does or what an attorney does. Well, in fact, we split this out by our community kids and our incarcerated kids. And here's what we find. For the community kids, that same pattern, those 14, 15, and younger, not competent to stand trial. Now, the detained kids are being pink. I'll let you all try to guess, will they be better or worse? Everybody place your votes. And the answer is they're actually worse. And the reason being is that when you actually go in and do IQ assessments of kids in the justice system, and this is also true for adults, the average IQ is around 85. That's about one full standard deviation from the mean, which is 100. So, and 100 is average. That's your C student. So we're looking at kids who have a lower deficit, who are more vulnerable, and these are the very kids we're putting into the system with the least understanding of what the system is doing. So as I conclude, as I only have 10 to 12 minutes, and I hope I've gotten interest in the area of what we're doing here at UCI, I'd like you to think about Paul Gingrich, who I spoke about earlier. Realize he's 12 years old, and a juvenile who can be tried and sentenced as an adult. He couldn't get a job at McDonald's. He wouldn't be allowed to buy a pack of cigarettes. Forget getting a cocktail. Rent a car. Rental agencies have known for years the age should be 25 to release a car to anybody. And he would not be allowed to vote. It's most important to remember adolescents are not miniature adults, and the legal system does have a responsibility to understand who these kids are and how we treat them. Thank you.